ready to talk hockey. Streaming from the Oilers Live Studio. Subscribe or follow today.
Hey, it's Michael here again for another Tuesday edition of Oilers Live. I'm pretty excited. I've got a pretty neat guest, at least the way I think, very neat guest. He is he's a hockey historian, let's call him, and the author of now two books, Hockey 365. What's it, daily reading? Is that what it is? Or
daily stories from the ice, and then Hockey 365, the second period, more daily stories from the ice.
Awesome, yeah. There's a mouthful there if you get the full title in, I guess. But
yeah,
excellent books, both of them. Highly rated. Some pretty neat reviews, if I might add, by some pretty big names in your industry and in the hockey world. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I read the pregame, as you call it, and the idea for Hockey 365 came to you on a beach of all places. Is that right?
It did indeed. Yeah.
So, run me through that. Like, were you just sitting in there, relaxing, enjoying the sun, and all of a sudden you thought, well, I should, what day is it today? And this is what happened on that day, or how'd that come about?
Yeah, so at that point, I had been writing about hockey for a couple of years during that season in particular. So I was on that beach in Mexico in February of 2017. So that was my first season writing for Vice Sports quite regularly. So I was building up a pretty decent portfolio, and I also had some other opportunities with places like Sportsnet. So I was kind of starting to amass some of these stories, and at the same time, I was also doing daily moments in hockey history from my Twitter account. At Mike Commito. And so I just kind of, thought more and more about it, and that what I was building up, maybe that could lend itself to a book. And the reason I thought about that was because at that time, because of all the hockey writing I was doing, all I was reading were hockey books. And at that time, I happened to bring Val James's autobiography to Mexico. And I was reading his book, which is, again, a great book, Black Ice, if you haven't checked it out before. And it just kind of struck me that I read so much hockey stuff that if I really wanted to write a book, I should write a hockey book. And at that time, I was actually under contract with the university press to take my PhD dissertation and turn it into a book. And I just couldn't get going with it. I'd been putting it off every day after work. I'd put it off until eventually I just realized my heart wasn't in it. I didn't want to do it. And so on my way back from Mexico, I started to sketch out a plan of what I wanted to write. And it was essentially what would become Hockey 365. We got back in Sudbury. I emailed the university press and asked to get released from my contract. They happily obliged. No money had changed hands, so it was kind of just a clean break. I hadn't really done anything on it anyway, so I don't think they were missed out on too much of an investment. And then I got to work on trying to figure out how I could make Hockey 365 a reality.
Yeah, that's excellent, and thank you for it. I mean, I think it was Brown Bears or Black Bears was the history.
Yeah. Black Bears, yeah.
Black Bears, yeah. Well, yeah, I love Black Bears, but I doubt I'd be reading a history book on Black Bears. So
yeah, it was a big part of my life for a good 5 years. That's what I was writing about. And of course, because of that, all the gifts I was getting from family and friends were all bear related. So, I had a black bear tie, any kind of accessory that had a bear on it, they bought it for me. My parents even bought me, a black bear toilet seat. My wife refused to bring that into the first house we bought. So I think it stayed at my parents' house. It's still there. So it never made the trip to the new house, but that was our lives. Was every year was like black bear stuff. We got to get it for Mike. So
that's right on. That's right on. I've got to ask, and now you've had this book out. You had the first one, which I think had some success, and certainly a lot of people read about it. In fact, the reason you're here tonight has a little bit to do of I happened to be in a bookstore and I snapped a picture of a bunch of hockey books, and asked the Twitter community. My following's a little smaller than yours. I asked them, what are you guys reading for hockey books? And of course, a couple of people came in and piped up and said, well, I'm reading Hockey 365, and they tagged you in there. And so that was, and then I saw that you had written the second period edition.
Mm-hmm.
and so wanted to have you on here. I've thankfully, and thanks to you, I've had a chance to read that. Some really great stories. I'll tell you, it's a ton of stuff I never knew about, and I didn't actually think you could find something for every day of the year, right? I mean, you'd figure come around late July or early August, it'd be pretty slim pickings. Was it hard to find items for those those kind of off-season areas?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I get that question a lot for the dog days of summer, because certainly I think, the signings and the other transactions start to dry up, especially late July and well into August, right? And so, but there's always at least something that's happened, and typically they're just on paper transactions and moves that occur. But what they allow you to do is kind of think outside the box. So again, the one example that's always stuck in my head is Archer Zerbe signing a contract with the Hurricanes, at some point in the dog days of summer. But I was able to use that in the first book as a jumping off point to kind of talk about his career up to that point. He had been kind of, bounced around a little bit. And then, after signing in Carolina, he had a resurgence there. So I think when you have those moments in the summertime, even though nothing really happens on that day other than somebody putting pen to paper, you can really kind of use that to step outside of that actual moment in hockey history and explore what happened that led up to that signing or trade. And then obviously to talk about what happened. I think that's the nice thing about history, is we have the gift of hindsight, that we can look back and, evaluate that signing or that trade and say it worked out quite well for the player of the team, or, in some cases it didn't. And you can kind of talk about that rather than just focusing on what happened that day, because by and large, those signings, there's nothing really notable about what happened, unless, of course, there was a press conference. But if there's a press conference about that signing, it's probably not happening in August, right? It's probably happening on July 1st or whenever free agency opens in a given year, right? So I didn't mind that. I found that obviously because of the pandemic, there were some moments to choose from, because for the first time, in NHL history, we had meaningful games being played in August and then well into September. I tried not to load up on those, because I think we've all had enough of the pandemic. And I think, that was only a year ago. So as much as I think that'll give me some more ammunition in future volumes, if we do the third period and overtime, we can kind of look back on, even the 2021 playoffs, where games are played, further into July than ever before. I think there's enough now that you can look back and really kind of fill up those days. But I prefer being able to kind of step outside the box and just focus more on player stories and team stories when it comes to those signings in the summertime.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. There's a couple of things come to mind when you're doing something like this and all of the research. So one of the first things, what's the oldest story that you've published so far to date? Do you know offhand?
Yeah. So I think in the first book we had, it was a story about when the first rules of hockey were formally published. And, that was in 1875. So that was definitely the oldest one in the first book. I believe in this book, I have a story between the first hockey game between Harvard and Yale. And I can't recall the exact dates off the top of my head. I want to say it's 1912. Certainly predated the NHL's arrival. So as much as the book is called Hockey 365, it definitely does predominantly pull from the NHL, which of course, was founded in 1917. And so you have a lot of stories from that period, or from that date up until the most recent 2020 playoffs. But certainly I tried to find some of those unusual stories that people aren't as familiar with. But predominantly I'm pulling largely from, the NHL era.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, because I'm here and most of the people that watch or listen to the podcast release know I'm based in Halifax now. And I didn't realize this, but Windsor, of course, Nova Scotia, lays claim to being the birthplace of hockey. I didn't know that until I was out traveling across Nova Scotia about a couple months ago. Anything about Windsor in there for the Nova Scotia folks that that listen?
No. So I don't want to tune out have the Nova Scotia folks tune out, but no, there's Windsor did not make the second period, but there will be a third period. So I'll make a note. Is. Yeah, there always is. So I'll make a note that should be on the list for the next one.
Yeah. Were you aware of that little fact, by the way?
Yeah, no, I've heard. I think there's off. It's funny when you look back because there's obviously hockey traces its origins back to Indigenous peoples here in Canada, and certainly I think there's other cities that have laid claim to being the cradle of hockey, or when did professional hockey form? Which city had the first league? So that's a whole interesting thing. I didn't necessarily get into that too much in these volumes, but I think definitely as a hockey history lover and someone who's I think consumed a lot of hockey history books over the years, it certainly crops up in a lot of volumes I've read.
Yeah. Now, outside of yourself, is there a go-to historian that you'd suggest, or somebody that if you had somebody you could sit around a campfire with or at a party talking to, that you think of that comes to mind that has a lot of hockey history up there in that noggin?
Well, I would have to honestly say Jen Conway, who, if any of your listeners know who that is, that's at NHL History Girl. She's probably the OG when it comes to sharing hockey history moments on Twitter. I kind of followed in her footsteps and tried to, do what she was doing, but I think kind of tailor to how I wanted to maybe convey some of those moments using, video and GIFs and things like that. But I think her continued ability to continue to post interesting moments in hockey history. I think she seems like she's really good at hockey trivia as well. I'm not a great trivia guy in any front. So as much as I think, I loaded up my brain with the research to get this book going, I must say that I'm not great at trivia questions. As much as I probably would have known the answer and filed it away to get a story done, it's just not something that stays with me. But she seems like she'd probably be somebody you'd want to have at that party, rhyming off facts. I think she does a great job with her on this day moments that she does as well, but also just kind of injecting these regular these other interesting facts throughout the day as well. So I think if you're going to have a hockey history party, Jen is probably going to be number one on your list. I've also definitely appreciated a lot of the work that Stan Fischler has done over the years. Certainly go back to that and read some of his old volumes. I think are always great. I remember we were vacationing in the Muskokas a couple of years ago, went to an old bookstore, and they had some of Stan's older books, and I picked those up for a couple bucks, but they've certainly come in handy over the years just to kind of reference back and see what he was thinking at the time. Yeah,
that's great. And by the way, for those listening, you can find Jen at NHL History Girl, and I definitely see her tweets come up once in a while. I wasn't following her. I am officially now. So
there we go.
Yeah, so that'd be good. And of course, are there any Oilers historians that you took to? Obviously, mostly Oilers fans that listen, and there's a lot of Oilers history in the past. More recent history, but any particular folks that you were in touch with or read through?
Not necessarily anyone that I would think is necessarily labels themselves as a historian, but I think because passionate hockey fans, by some extension, I think are passionate about the history of their teams. And so I think there's quite a few Oilers accounts that I follow. Bruce McCurdy is one that comes to mind where, again, I don't think Bruce would style himself as a historian, but I think certainly given his, perspective and coverage of the game throughout the years, like I think he is a go-to, for some of that Oilers wisdom. So I think, I couldn't necessarily say a historian that comes to mind, but I think, and I'm kind of drawing a blank on some of those Oilers accounts, so I apologize, to those individuals out there. But certainly, I think you've got to follow, I think, the most ardent fans within those respective circles, and through whoever it is, you'll get like some great perspective on what's currently happening, and somebody who's probably covered that team or watched that team develop over the years, and they can recall, some of the highs and lows from as far back as the 80s.
Yeah, I can think of a few, and most of the people that listen again know who these are, like Bruce McCurdy. I don't know if you know Alan Mitchell, Low Tide.
Yes.
Yeah. Bob Stauffer,
another good
of course. Bob seems to remember absolutely everything that's ever happened to him over the past 40 years. Incredible memory. Probably a guy you'd want at that trivia contest. And then, of course, it would have been great to talk to Rod Phillips at any time to hear some of his perspectives going on the trail with the Oilers during those big times. Of course, Hall of Famer as well. Yeah, so I found it interesting, and I actually I respect why you did it, but you didn't put an index in there, and you
No.
call that out. It's just so that folks like myself that are big fans of one team or the other don't just go in and read specific stories tailored to that team.
Mhm.
Uh, so I thought that was kind of neat, and of course, that's the first thing that came to mind was, oh, where are all the Oilers stories? But
Yeah.
after I read your explanation, I felt a little guilty thinking that, and so I did read it day 1 through day 365,
Well,
and
yeah, I appreciate that. That was definitely a conscious, or that was a deliberate decision with the first book. I don't think we made a note about why we didn't have the index, but it was for that exact reason you mentioned, was we wanted people to try to read it cover to cover, rather than just kind of skimming through their favorite teams or players. This time around, I obviously drew attention to that in case, somebody were to ask again. I think one of the other things that people like to do, if once they realize there's no index and they can't find their favorite player or team, is find your birthday and find out what happened on your birthday. That's always something that some people say to me when they've cracked the book for the first time. Is the first story I flipped to, sorry, was my birthday, and they'll tell me what happened on that day.
yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. I actually didn't do that. Uh,
No.
maybe I'm in the weirder bunch, but wouldn't be the first time. Now, curious because you say there's other folks you'd like to have at that hockey trivia table. Is it something though? I mean, you've put a lot of blood and sweat into these 2 volumes, no doubt. Do you remember each day in particular? Like, would you be able to say, wake up today and say September 14th? Well, that's what happened on this day. Are you pretty good with that?
Uh, Sometimes yes. It honestly depends. I think when you're living in it and you're like, 'cause when it comes time to write this book, it's basically just it's like a mix between a marathon and a sprint, because you're constantly working on it every day, but it is like through a protracted period of time. So just to kind of give you some inside baseball here, I started writing this book just kind of quietly on my own in June of last year. I hadn't contacted the publisher about whether or not we could explore a second volume or not. I just wanted to see if I had the appetite to do this all over again. So I kind of went at it quietly for a couple months, and I think I'd made some good progress, and I was happy with where it was going. I was enjoying everything. So then we finally we made things official in August of 2020, and then I had until January to complete the manuscript. So I had a couple months head start, but it's a 6-month turnaround from when that manuscript needs to be filed. And so when I did the first book, I didn't start writing until I had a formal agreement in hand. And so that was the same time period, August to January. So it was a really crazy ride for the first one. I knew how taxing it was to try to get all of that done outside of being at work and trying to be a good dad and good husband. So this time I tried to build in at least a couple extra months of wiggle room. And I think in the moment, because every day you're focused on what am I going to write about today? How am I going to take this moment in history and distill it down to 350 words? You start to know where all these pieces kind of fit together. And so I think in that moment, your brain is trained to think about it in that way. And I think if you would ask me that question, even 6 months ago when I was still in the thick of editing it, I could probably give you some, if you were to rhyme off random dates, I could probably tell you what they were. To be honest, right now, it would probably be luck of the draw. I'd probably have to look at the book myself. Even I'm thinking of my birthday, and I honestly don't even know what happened that day, what I wrote about in that book, right? So it's I think in the moment you're so invested in it, and then once you've kind of cleared those major milestones, you kind of just let it all out, so you can move on to the next task.
Yeah, that's no big surprise. I mean, anytime anybody that's written anything, right, would probably tell you the same. Up to and the time that it goes anywhere, you remember seemingly every detail, and then once you've hit send, so to speak, that's it. It kind of leaves your
Yeah.
leaves your brain just as fast as it went. So I did have one comment on Twitter about the no Nova Scotia references, and the question then was, what about the CHL, or the Color Hockey League in the Maritimes in the 1800s? And obviously, I don't think that made it in, but you did reference black ice, and you referenced something else, which is, kind of a theme, in recent years, which is diversity. You've got, obviously, in the second period, I know your focus is mainly on the NHL. I think, though, you did a great job of incorporating women's hockey and of course some of the black hockey leagues and that, or black players in the league. I think that's great. Those things, I guess, they have to be. It's got to be a conscious effort, I think, in order to include all of that. Did you find that sort of a difficult process in order to make that work out for the second period?
No, yeah, because you're right. I think with this one, I had tried, to do that more. I know that in the first book, despite the fact that it's Hockey 365, it was predominantly focused on the NHL. There was a couple stories about women's hockey history, or at least some women's moments in hockey in the first one. But the reason why I tried more this time around, and again, admittedly, it's still very much focused on the NHL, which is and remains a predominantly white men's league, and so those are the stories that are kind of peppered throughout. But I had people coming up to me after the first book who would tell me that my son or daughter isn't a huge reader, but they're a huge hockey fan, and they read your book cover to cover. And so it kind of dawned on me that when I went into the first book writing this, I didn't think that kids would be my target audience, right? I thought I was writing for people like myself who wanted to read hockey history, and I think that's still a big part of the audience. But I think because the book is written in such a way that I believe is fun and accessible, and obviously by having each story just as a page, it's pretty it's easily digestible from readers from the age of 10 all the way up to 80, right? And so I think because I knew more about that this time around, I heard from parents that my son read this book and he loved it and he can't stop, rhyming off hockey history facts. I felt that I had more of an obligation to try to dig up more of those stories that sometimes get overlooked. I think certainly there's still a long way to go. And I think that ultimately when it comes to the third period or other later volumes, that I still have a lot of heavy lifting to do, I think, to bring more of those stories into focus. I think, the Colored People's Hockey League did not make it into the second volume. That was actually a book that I had read during the pandemic. It was just a matter of, I think, sometimes trying to line up the dates and trying to find the corroborating evidence to make sure that, what we've read or what we found actually happened on this day. But I think that that's all part of the process. And I think that's the nice thing about hockey history, is that you could fill multiple volumes, right? We could talk about going into overtime and, sudden death, second overtime, third overtime, on and on and on, right? So certainly I don't think my job is done. I think there's still some more stories to tell, and hopefully to expand the lens, to include all people in those stories as well.
Yeah. No, and I think that's great. And I admire, I'm myself am 50% Cree. So, recognize, the Indigenous people and their contribution to the game of hockey. And I do appreciate when people make, at least an effort to do what they can to, include some of the diversity that is our game. And I think it's great. And as I said, I thought that, you did well. You're right about the NHL. It's, a men's league, and it's predominantly white, but there are other stories to be told. And so I think you did a great job. On top of that, I guess, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about, as you said, you're not going to remember every date, but there's got to be a couple of stories that, in your research kind of maybe either surprised you or were most memorable for you. Maybe one or two stories that you, off the top of your head, that kind of, maybe opened your eyes a little bit, or you thought, hey, that's kind of neat. I didn't realize that happened.
Yeah, no, that definitely happened a few times. One that immediately comes to mind, because I didn't know the story before I ended up going into it, was I knew that I was going to include a story about when the Kings acquired Terry Harper from the Canadians. And he had quite a story growing up. He had some significant burns as a youngster. Doctors didn't think, that he would obviously ever play hockey, let alone walk. But they had agreed that in order to try to rehabilitate his legs, to have him play hockey, despite the fact that they thought he wouldn't be able to, he obviously was able to overcome his injuries and, went on to have a, storied hockey career. But so I thought I was just going to write a story about Harper, going to LA. He became a captain there. He was obviously a big part of, those early Kings teams. But what I discovered as I was doing the research on Harper was that he was part of that trade that brought Marcel Dion to the Kings. But what I didn't know is that he initially he refused to report to Detroit at first. And he actually ended up starting litigation against the Kings in the NHL because he had just recently signed a contract with the Kings to stay in LA. And after sending him to Detroit, he felt that the Kings had breached contract with him. And so he was at the time, property of the Detroit Red Wings, but also suing the league and suing the Kings. And so he finally eventually agreed to drop both lawsuits when the Red Wings agreed to renegotiate his contract in Detroit. And so he did end up playing that season with the Red Wings, but he was obviously a little bit delayed because of his legal battles. But that was one where, again, I just wanted to tell a story about Terry Harper because to me, I thought it was significant enough, overcoming his childhood injuries to the accomplishments he had in Montreal and ultimately what he did with those early Kings teams coming in as an expansion team. But then you kind of find this other angle that you didn't even know about, right? And so I had to include that. So that's always fun, is when you have an idea about what the story could be about, and then you uncover this, have to pull on this further and find out where that went and what the result was. And again, as much as you only have 350 words, I was able to try to pack all of that in there. Certainly, I don't think you get the full nuance of the legal proceedings in that span, but enough to have people kind of say, "Hey, I might not have known that either," and that's kind of what the book's all about.
Yeah, that's I think that's interesting, and it kind of brings another thing to mind. I think I've heard it said about screenwriting. You end up there's some things when you write a screenplay you just take out because you thought they were so important to the story, but you don't have room for them and you have to take them out. There's got to be a couple of stories that you're disappointed didn't make it in, right? Whether they just didn't fit. Because I mean, you're going day by day. You either have that day covered already or you don't, right? Is there enough out there? I mean, you're saying there's enough for a third period, probably an overtime, maybe even a double overtime, and so on. There's got to be some. Are there any stories that you're disappointed didn't make them in? And you don't have to tell us what they are because we don't want to ruin them for the next. But are there some stories that you're disappointed didn't make it in?
There's actually one that I had tried. I tried hard to fit it in there. And I'll share this one because I've shared it on Twitter, so it's not trade secrets by any means. But this was it was a report from the 1930s about this. It was in a boys league, and there was this goaltender. I believe his name was Abby Goldberg. I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. But you can try to find the tweet. And the story was that he had played a hockey game in net, but he had a pack of matches in his pocket along with a cellophane comb. And when the puck hit him in his pocket, it hit with such force that it struck the matches, which then ignited the comb. And so, I think the headline was goalie pants on fire. And so it became this thing where, and again, I think it was, I shared it on Twitter, and it kind of, I thought it was great. And I think we got a lot of interesting responses from people who probably hadn't heard that story because it wasn't from a professional league. It wasn't from the NHL. It was from this poor 10-year-old boy in Montreal. What I struggled with was that, it obviously would have had to have taken the place of a more significant moment in hockey history. I was also unsure of, could we verify that actually happened on the day that it did? Again, certainly you look at the day when the story was published in the newspaper, and, they'll typically say on a Thursday night, so you can go back and try to pinpoint that day in the calendar. But, this wasn't a league where there were probably plenty of reporters following the games, right? So it was kind of one of those things where I had the story almost written in my mind of how it was going to kind of flow, and people were going to be, I've never heard of this before. This is really interesting. Ultimately, I decided not to do it. I forget what we ended up putting in place of that, but that's one where I think I would revisit. I think maybe further down the line, just to find more fun, quirky stories. I think that's a great one that again, where I tried in earnest to try to, justify it in my mind to include that. But I think poor Abby will have to wait maybe till the third or the overtime volume to have that story included.
Yeah. It sounds to me like the legitimacy of the dates are very important to you. I mean, it's maybe important. Maybe you do some type of an edition where the dates don't matter, right? And maybe the stories do.
Yeah, that would be a lot. That'd be, I think, a little less stressful, because certainly I think I agonize over the facts. We obviously have a fact checker that works with us too, and I certainly, double, triple fact check my work. Obviously, I know that you're not going to catch everything, but yeah, I think if you were to do a best of the theme of Hockey 365 and you just pick the best stories from around from across the year without necessarily being too worried about this happened exactly on this day, we know it happened probably around this month or this week. That's maybe where we can include a story like that.
Yeah. Still a great story nonetheless. I'm kind of curious now. I'm just thinking as I'm listening to you speak about this black bear history of the black bears, and then I know a little bit about you. You do you're a historian for the Sudbury Wolves, if I'm not mistaken. You do some work for the LA Kings. You've written for across all of these different hockey platforms. Well, how? Like what? What? How does somebody? Was it a natural transition, or were you kind of like some bloggers out there got their start just writing a few stories here and there, and while you were doing your PhD and that, or how did it all come about? How did you become this hockey historian, this guy that's writing us all these stories now?
Yeah, I would say it wasn't a seamless transition. I was studying, the history of black bear hunting and management in Ontario at McMaster University in Hamilton. And, I had obviously taken a wide array of history courses throughout my time in university, including, sport history. I'd read a lot of sport history. I'd read hockey history. I just never made the connection that was something I could pursue. I always, after starting my master's, I'd focused on a forest fire. So then I just kind of found myself in the environmental history field, which led to the whole, the black bear topic. But it was kind of when I was going through that, I was looking for a different outlet, to kind of channel some of my creativity through that process. And I realized that the skills I was developing as a historian, the researching skills, the communication skills, could lend themselves to hockey and telling hockey history stories, or just telling any kind of hockey story. And so I did admittedly start just my own website. I had my own blog where I was doing it was like a mashup of Canadian history with my expectations for the slate of Canadian NHL teams that were playing that night. So I would say, on this day in 1931, the Statute of Westminster was signed, and tonight these 5 games are happening. Here's what I think the main storylines are going to be, and here's my predictions. And I, did that throughout the season, tallied up, my wins and loss record. It was more on the losses than on the wins. And that's really kind of how I got my feet wet. I ended up then from there adapting that idea for a Kings fan blog called The Royal Half, where I was doing moments in California history, but then sandwiching Pacific Division games between it. And I was doing that every Tuesday, Thursday night, where I would provide a different moment in California history and then my take on what was going to happen in the Pacific that night. And, I appreciated The Royal Half for giving me that outlet and letting me kind of find my voice. It was a bit of a Frankenstein that I don't know who the demographic was that wanted both the hardcore, like Canadian or California history, along with my take on what the Kings were going to do in Dallas that night. But I think it kind of gave me the confidence to move forward. I got some other opportunities here with my local paper, the Northern Life, to kind of take that Canadian history thing and adapt it for that. But it was after doing that for a few years that I realized that if I really wanted to kind of make further inroads into, the hockey world, I should probably just stick with the hockey stories. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's plenty of great hockey writers and historians out there that I've been following and reading over the years. And I just felt that this was the thing that I really liked to write about. I certainly liked what I was doing in academia, but it just wasn't something I saw myself doing long term. I didn't think that I had the appetite or the stomach for writing peer-reviewed journal articles. I wanted to write stories that people would read and connect with and have fun with. And so that's kind of where the hockey came from. And to be honest, from there, it just kind of snowballed. I got some opportunities with Vice, with Sportsnet, had a couple bylines with The Athletic, and then that's kind of where the book kind of came into it. And then within, like right around the time that the book came out, I started doing my first stories for the LA Kings. To date, I've written over 50 stories for the Kings. And I also became the Sudbury Wolves team historian just a few months before the first book was released in 2018. And so, again, I think I've been fortunate enough to get some opportunities that have come my way. But I think certainly it was not a clear path. I definitely did not go into my PhD thinking that I would end up coming out of this with 2 books about hockey history. I think that if I were to think about what I thought my journey would be at the time when I started my PhD in 2010, I would have thought I would have a book in front of me about history of black bear hunting, and that's what we'd be talking about, right? But life is a journey, and it's fun if you just kind of enjoy the ride.
Yeah, no kidding. I 100% agree. So let's maybe switch gears a bit, because I'm interested in this. I know we're talking about the book tonight, but the Sudbury Wolves. And I wish I remembered his name. A couple of years ago, I played hockey with the guy who played for the Sudbury Wolves. I was living out in Calgary, and he played just shinny hockey, and he'd come and he'd have his old Wolves jersey on or something, maybe a practice jersey or something. I knew he played for them. Anyway, now every team's got a Wikipedia. Do you regularly check the Wikipedia for make sure it's got the right facts? I'm just curious about this because I mean, honestly, if I was a historian, that's what I'd be doing. I'd be constantly checking my area of interest and saying, well, that's not right. That'd be a full-time job.
Yeah, no, I think that could be a full-time job, not just for the Wolves, but I think for all the teams out there. I think, and I will admit that I think the Wolves page is probably a little more sparse than what you'd find at the NHL, but I think I would definitely go to that and check it out. I would never make edits, but I would kind of flag things where I would uncover through the course of my research that didn't happen the day that that it said it did, or maybe these individuals were not involved. But I think in my role as team historian for the Wolves, I think it was kind of going into it, you thought you'd be doing more of those, I think the curation and, preservation of those moments in hockey history. But I think what became clear pretty early on was that what the goal behind that whole project has been is to try to find ways to connect, I think, the younger fans that we have now with the previous generations. I mean, the Wolves have been around in Sudbury since 1972. They've had a lot of great players over the years. There's people who take their kids to games now, or grandparents who take their kids to games now, that watched, Mike Foligno and Ron Duguay and Randy Carlyle tear it up in the 70s. And, up until recently, like, you're watching Quinton Byfield do his thing with the Wolves, in the time that he was here before he was drafted second overall by the Kings. And so it was always, there's that communal spirit there where you're taking family members to the game, and you have these family members who remember these different eras in Wolves history. And it's just a matter of trying to connect with them in that way to try to, build that investment into the team across the board. And so that was always the goal. And so I think we realized that it wasn't going to be me, in an archives trying to, put all these documents together so that future historians could look at them. It was more of telling those stories immediately that could have an impact with the fans. But I think the other thing that I didn't necessarily see my role as when I first started, that I came to appreciate and I think kind of take pride in, was that at the junior hockey level, you have players that come and go quite regularly. Not all of them stick around for 4 years. Some of them are there for a season, some are there for 2, and then they're gone. And, you have the Quinton Byfields who hopefully go on to have a great NHL career, but you have other guys who are just as valuable to those local clubs that don't go on to play professional hockey. Maybe they go overseas for a few years and they play hockey there, but they come back and they get careers in various fields, from becoming firefighters to doctors or accountants for that matter. And so I thought it was a great way to connect with the alumni family, because it's such a huge group, because you have these players who may only spend a couple of years with you and they go on and do whatever it is they do. And sometimes you lose track of them, right? So I think it was kind of a cool opportunity for the team to keep tabs on some of those players and kind of celebrate them by having these stories done about them. So I think that was something I didn't really fully realize going into it. But I think now, as I think about what it would be like to be a team historian, I think a big part of your job is connecting with the alumni and making sure that they're properly, celebrated and accounted for in the team's history.
Yeah, I think that's great. I have a couple of relatives, uncles that played in the WHL, and I think like they didn't go on, of course, to play in the NHL, but I love the fact that they are celebrated with the teams that they played for, just for having been alumni. I think it's really neat that there's an active part of the team that's doing that. And one thing that came to mind, though, you mentioned Ron Duguay. I didn't realize he played for the Sudbury Wolves. Is there like a Zapruder film or something of him with his hair flowing, skating? Because I can only imagine what those locks looked like in the 70s. I mean, he was, of course, he played in LA. Have you had a chance to meet him?
We've interacted a little bit on Twitter. I'd hoped to do a story about him with the Wolves. It just never kind of worked out the timing wise. But yeah, I think that, I think back to him, I picture him more with the Rangers, obviously, in his flowing hair. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of great photographs that the team has been able to preserve over the years, right? So I would imagine that maybe there's some fans who had photographs, or maybe some from the newspaper coverage, but yeah, to see it, I think in film though, is really give you the full appreciation of what he had, right? So,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, what I remember of Ron Duguay, kind of off topic, but I feel like he was smiling at the fans as he was skating by all the time too. I mean, he's quite the character, and he's still quite the character. I see him, he's doing some broadcasting now, of course, and he does those cameos that are becoming quite popular, and he's quite hilarious. When you do get to talk to him, you'll have to let me know. Yeah, I think he's a character, and a good personality in the league. And probably, I'm like, is there somebody when you think about the Sudbury Wolves, like a character or a personality that comes to mind that was maybe the life of the Wolves over a period of time? I know kids, they don't get to play too long at the junior level, right? So maybe it's hard to but. When you think about the Blades, of course, you think Wendell Clark or somebody like that. Like is somebody that sort of when everybody thinks of the Sudbury Wolves, and sorry, I don't know a ton about them, but is there somebody that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually quite a few guys, especially in town, right? Because again, with these clubs, it's usually a local following. It's not necessarily expected that you'd have a household name in a different city, unless, of course, they did something notorious. And they were probably remembered for all the wrong reasons by the opposing team. But I mean, I think of guys, who didn't necessarily go on to have NHL careers. I think of Norm Milley, who had, he's now coaching in the OHL, but he was quite the player in Sudbury. I think he was the last player to have back-to-back, 50-goal seasons, if I'm not mistaken. And he was just a fan favorite. He worked hard. He had that type of game, but he was also very gifted defensively. So somebody like that is somebody who, I wasn't in Sudbury at the time when Norm was going through his heyday, but you talk to fans of the Wolves who have been living in Sudbury their lives, and it's easy to say the Folignos or Carlisle or Duguay, but you hear the name Norm Milley quite a bit because of what he did. Jamie Rivers is another one that comes up, and certainly I think he's still part of the game now with what he's doing in St. Louis. But I think he was a fan favorite here in Sudbury. I've had the chance to talk to him over the years about his role at the Wolves, and he was fortunate to be a part of the club in the in the early to mid 90s when they had some strong playoff runs. So I think for somebody like him, you remember him because he had such a long career at the Wolves as well, and he obviously logged a lot of miles for the team. But it's guys like that, and obviously Rivers went on to have an NHL career, so I just kind of contradicted what I said. But I think of another guy like Bobby Chaumont who had played quite a lot of games for the Wolves, was an integral part of some of those runs. He didn't go on to play in the NHL, but I think locally here, he's a guy who I think is the life of the party as well. I had the chance to meet him a few times. So yeah, I think that's the the nice thing about the allegiances we have to our local junior clubs is you get to know those players because they are a part of the community. Obviously if they're there for longer, they really kind of embed themselves in the fabric of that town, and you get to know them and support them and kind of follow their progress. But I think that's always the kind of the thing is if you talk to somebody locally, they might say Quentin Byfield, but they remember those other players who made it, who had a different kind of impact, not just because they were the superstars and were drafted, second overall, but because of the other things that they did for the community and some of the other things they did as part of their time with the team.
Yeah, and for those listening, there are some ex and big name Oilers that played for the Wolves. Ethan Moreau, one that Mike Pekka, of course, who was part of the 2006 team that went to the finals.
One other one I would say just for the Oilers is Zach Stortini.
Huggy Bear.
Is a Wolves alumnus, and he's now coaching with the Wolves as well.
Oh, is he?
Right on. Yeah. He's one of the assistants or one of the associates. And it's funny in terms of guys that you remember. I always think back. I went to high school with Zach briefly. He came to Lockerbie where I went to high school for a year or so. And I'd always see him in the gym in the summer. And I always found it was hilarious because he was such a down to earth, genuine guy that he would always want to ask me, quite earnestly, like, what was I up to? What was going on in my life when we knew that he was playing in the NHL that year. So certainly anything that I could have said, in my opinion, would have paled to what he did. But he genuinely wanted to know what you were doing. I was taking history of Laurentian, and to him, that was the coolest thing.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that he could have probably shared some stories with me that, would have made my head spin. So that's what I always appreciate about a guy like Storts, was just how down to earth and genuine and sincere he is with everybody.
Yeah, no, you know what, that comes off. I have had the chance to play at a couple of pro-ams with Ethan Moreau and enjoyed playing with him. Quite the character. In fact, played on his line both times I played, and yeah, I mean he's a fun guy too. Of course, he's still in the area. I think Niagara Falls right now. So kind of neat. Yeah, that's really cool. Wolves have a good team this year, do you know? Just curious, because I like to follow Junior as well.
Yeah, I think they've got it's always comes down to, it seems over the years, goaltending with the team, right? And I can't speak to where I think the goaltending is going to be at this year, but I think if they recently won, the first overall selection. So they've got, Quentin Musty, who's an American player coming in, who, again, if he lives up to his billing, should, be a difference maker this year. But what I think, is something to keep an eye on as well, is that Chase Stillman, who was recently drafted 29th overall by the Devils, is probably likely to come back to Sudbury this year. And I think he's got something to prove by being a first-round pick. I think a lot of the prognosticators out there didn't have him going in the first round. I think they probably had him going in the second round, maybe later towards the end of the second round. So I think he's aware of that, and he knows that he wants to come back to Sudbury and be a leader and to be that veteran of that team, because before COVID he was obviously a rookie. So he's I think looking to take his game to the next level. He had a really good tournament at the U18 World Championship before the draft, which I think helped his stock rise up, because he had proven that he could be he could play on both sides of the puck. He had pretty dogged, fierce player who wasn't afraid to go into the corners, and so he has, I think, all of these attributes to his game that could make for, a really great all-around player. But it's just a matter of, I think, him taking it to the next level and proving that the Devils were right in taking them where they did. So I think if he comes back, plus, some of the other veterans are coming back and some of the new players who we haven't had the chance to really see, over the last year and a half because of, hockey at those levels really being shut down. I'm just really excited about being able to get back into that old barn. It's been around since the early 50s. If your listeners aren't familiar with the Sudbury Arena, I'll share this one quirk about it that, and this goes back to pre-OHL or pre-OHA days. They have this taxidermic wolf that hangs from the rafters. And whenever the Wolves score, they hit a switch and the wolf goes across this pulley and it stops in front of the opposing team's bench, just kind of hovers in front of them, taunting them. And then they retract the wolf. It goes back up into its corner, and they do that. So there's nothing better than going to a Wolves game when they're lighting the lamp. That wolf keeps going by. It doesn't matter how many times you've seen the Wolves play. It doesn't matter if you're 36 years old like me, or if you're taking your daughter for the first time. The look on people's faces when that wolf comes out is priceless, and it's always a treat to take somebody to a Wolves game for the first time, because you want to tell them, keep your eye on that corner. If they score, that's the first thing you have to look at is to watch the wolf make its run across the ice.
Oh, that's right on. I wasn't aware of that, but that's really cool. Yeah, I got out to as soon as I got here. I'm new to Halifax, but this year I got season tickets for the Mooseheads.
Oh, right on.
I'm a big junior hockey fan, and of course the Q is an exciting league, as is the OHL. They all are, to be fair. But I did get out to a preseason game here a couple nights ago, and it was great just to be in an arena again and watching a team play and hearing the whistle and hearing the ice and all of those things that I think we took for granted for so long.
Yeah.
And so it's really great, and hopefully all stays as is. And I'm watching a lot of Mooseheads hockey this year. Of course, World Juniors will be back as well. I just got a note in my email that my tickets are still available for Edmonton. So maybe I'll be spending some time over Christmas with some old friends. We'll see.
Not a bad way to spend the holiday.
Yeah, no kidding. So I've got to ask, and we're closing in at the end of the hour, but there's got to be, we talked a little bit about this, 350 word limit. Let's get back to this, to your book. So Hockey 365, the second period. What's a story that you can think of that you really had to crunch it to get it down to 350 words that here and now you got 9 minutes. Maybe you don't need to use them all up, but what's one that you can think of the story that you just there's way more to it. Is there one that comes to mind?
Well, I mean, I think all of them you could devote more than 350 words, right? But I think to go back to one of the points I made earlier, that I think in the moments as you start to get into it more and you get a rhythm and you're doing 2 of these, 3 of these a day, every day for like basically 6 months straight, your brain figures out how to take what is oftentimes like a very, complicated or protracted period in a player's career or in a team's, history, and try to like strip away as much of it as you can without losing too much nuance, that it kind of becomes a skill, right? And so I think that once I kind of got into that groove, like, you just knew and accepted that you were not going to be able to talk about all of that, right? It's just impossible to say, well, we can add this in, and I can add this, and I can add this in. So I think that was, one of the things I learned going into this process, especially knowing that we had the limit. There were certainly some times where, sentences had to get cut, things had to be removed just because we were going to be over and it was going to go over to the next page. But I think just knowing that was the game plan going into it, I had accepted the fact that you weren't going to get to tell everything, right? And I think there's definitely sentences where you're like, we should have kept that because I thought it was a really great line, and that, maybe I thought it was funny, but the editor's like, it's not that funny, we can get rid of it. But yeah, I think because you know what it's like going into it, you're more, I think, in a better position to kind of, cut ties with certain sections that you're just not going to be able to cover. I think one of the other nice things is that, while one story focuses on one event that happened on that given day, I've revisited other stories, right? So players appear in multiple stories. So if you're not able to kind of cover it in one story, you can kind of shelve them to another part of the book and kind of pick it up there, maybe where you left off. So no, I think it wasn't necessarily as challenging, as I think you might expect, because I think once you kind of get into the groove, you just kind of know that that's your reality, right? And that you're going to have to cut it off at some point, and you're just going to have to accept the fact that, I think also part of it too is knowing that the hardcore hockey history fans know how those stories end. So yeah. I think I have game 1 of, the 1993 playoff series between the Leafs and the Kings. We know how that story ends. I don't talk about how that story ends because obviously it's painful to revisit, but it's kind of leaves off that the Leafs won that first game, and it was obviously a pretty night to remember with Clark and McSorley. But I don't revisit the series again in the book, but we all know what happens in game 7, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, and I was just kind of hopping around today's date because, it's relevant as we're reading, I mean, if I was to read it and I suspect most people will be like me. They, in fact, one of the reviews you got from a pretty big name, I think, was, I had a hard time sticking to one day at a time, and you certainly can't once you start reading it, and you read and you keep reading and you realize you've done a week, maybe 2 weeks in there. But if I'm just going around, of course, tomorrow is the Howard Chuck to Lemieux to Gretzky to Lemieux goal, which is phenomenal, and a Canada Cup, which I miss from those days I think you just said you're in your mid-30s, so you probably don't remember that quite with the same level that I remember it. It was pretty exciting. I'm about 10 years older. And in fact, you probably would have been like 2 or 3 at the time.
Yeah.
So it's too bad. But I'm sure you've seen tons of video. But
Yeah.
live it was, of course, pretty intense and pretty exciting. That was an interesting time. But the one that September 19th. I don't know if you remember what that date is.
I have the book, so I could do
right.
a quick flip. So I'm prepared.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, you might have a couple copies nearby.
Yeah, I've got a couple copies kicking around for sure.
Yeah, so there's one, for you as a Leafs fan, for me as an Oilers fan, of course, that was, a bit of a big deal. Again, you were probably like 5 or 6 years old, but I've got some friends over at Let's Go Blues Radio, and you actually have another story, I believe, about St. Louis acquiring Grant Fuhr. So Grant Fuhr has obviously shown up, a couple times, and as I'm sure a lot of for Oilers fans, in fact, there's a ton of Oilers history in here from those years. Do you remember much about this particular the Maple Leafs and Fuhr? Do you remember much about that? I know I'm putting you on the spot. I know it's
No, I remember writing that one, and again, it was another one where again you knew about like his hiatus from the Oilers because of his substance abuse issues, right? So this was kind of his first return to the league. I just liked how he happened to be playing preseason game against the Leafs, and it was like the Leafs wanted to acquire Fuhr. They probably wanted to acquire him for quite some time to get a caliber goalie like Fuhr in the net. And so I think that's another one where we know that the transaction happens on paper on September 19th, but certainly I think that's an example where you can kind of go back, talk about his time with the Oilers, what kind of led up to his departure, and then ultimately what happened with his time in the Leafs and how he was flipped to Buffalo, which ultimately brought Dave Anderchuk back to the Leafs, which was obviously also a pretty instrumental move for Toronto fans, for the Leafs, and Toronto fans remember that. So I think that's what I try to do with those stories is again when you can kind of go, try to find as much information as you can about that player and see what else is interesting other than just what happened that day. Because certainly, again, it's still pretty much, not quite the dog days of summer, but September 19th, we're still just in the middle of preseason, still, a few weeks away from the regular season starting. And so if you're able to kind of take something beyond, what had led up to that trade in a preseason matchup, I think it just adds a little bit more color to the story.
Yeah. I and you would know better than anybody, but I think history is a lot like a true crime story, right? Or a detective, and that big wall where they've got all the little pieces and web together, everything. That's one of the things that sort of struck me. Of course, I remember all of the Oilers stuff that came up, but one of the ones that came up was the Oilers offer sheet to Vanek.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is if you had, for instance, if that had gone the other way and Buffalo had said, go ahead. Well, that's Taylor Hall, that's Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, that's Jordan Eberle, and I know Taylor Hall appeared in there. I don't know about Eberle and Nugent-Hopkins just off the top of my head, but Taylor Hall definitely. The trade for Larson appeared in your book. I mean, this is, it just struck me as I'm reading this, this sort of web and these dominoes that fall. Does that? I'm sure that must come into mind at all. Like, this, I mean, you just mentioned it. That's what precipitates the Anderchuk, right? Going back to Toronto and
and it's funny you mention that, because when I initially had wrote that story about the Vanek offer sheet, part of, I think I'd actually had a draft where it was like the hindsight, right? What if the Sabres, didn't match and they took those 4 first round picks? What would Buffalo look like? What would Edmonton look like? That was an example actually where I didn't have enough time to probably get into that properly to see, to set this up, that obviously we know what those picks ended up being for Edmonton. But what would it be? Certainly, obviously, you can't exactly say that they would exactly line up the way that they would, because certainly the standings come into account and where those teams would have finished. But it would have been it's those hypothetical exercises of what could have happened, right? And I think that's always, I think you could do a book just on that, about like all these what ifs in hockey history of trades that didn't come to fruition, or offer sheets that, you know, weren't matched or were matched, and what was the result of that. So I think, you know, that would probably lend itself to a book where you're not constrained by, you know, the days of the week. I think you could definitely go into more detail about like what would have it been like for, you know, for Buffalo if that happened, right? And what would have meant for Edmonton. So yeah, no, it's that is, I had that in there, and then I cut it because it was getting kind of unruly. So I just said, like, we don't have enough time. Let's just focus on Vanek. There's kind of a neat little, you know, ending point there when he gets traded to the Islanders, right? So
yeah, no, that's great. And if you happen to do a what if book, I hope in the pregame you mentioned that.
I got the idea from Michael on Oilers Live.
Oilerslive Tuesday. Yeah. Hey, Mike, we've been at this for about an hour, and it's been great. I could definitely talk to you all night, and or for 365 days. I'll let you finish just by kind of letting everybody know where they can find Hockey 365, where they can find you, and then any other little last tidbits you might have.
Sure. Well, yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Mike Commito. And then, of course, the book is Hockey 365, the second period, more daily stories from the ice. It's not officially out yet in Canada. It comes out on September 28th, but you can still pre-order it from wherever you like to get books. That includes Amazon, Indigo, or your favorite independent bookseller. If you just want to go in and ask them to pre-order it for you, they will. But otherwise, in 2 weeks' time from today, exactly, the book will be out. So I look forward to doing that. It's obviously going to be a little bit different this year. I did an in-person launch 3 years ago. Might be a bit of a mix of in-person and virtual delivery this year. But I'm still excited to get the book out there and have people read it. So I think, that's probably where I'd leave it at, is if you can find me on Twitter, you'll probably find where you can buy the book. But definitely check it out wherever you like to buy books. You can find it there under Hockey 365.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I'll get you to stick around just for another minute. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. We're out of here.